You can't divide love, but you sure can divide money, and that's when you see who really loved you in the first place. That's what I whispered to myself that night, sitting at the edge of my bed, the paper still trembling in my hand. My father's signature was at the bottom, a small, elegant curve of ink that carried the weight of generations, but right beside it, in sharp, clear type, were the words that stripped me of my share of Grandpa's inheritance. I stared at the lamp on my nightstand, the soft yellow light pooling across the carpet, and I thought, how did it come to this? How did the boy who used to share his toys with me, who used to sneak into my room when thunderstorms scared him, become the man who smiled while taking everything away? But maybe I should start before that night, before the paper, before the signature, before my family started looking at me like I didn't belong anymore. Growing up, my family was never rich, but we were comfortable. My dad, Frank Miller, worked as a mechanic for 30 years. My mom, Evelyn, was a nurse. And Grandpa Dad's father was the quiet pillar behind us all. He was one of those old-school men, hands rough from carpentry, heart soft as pie crust. He didn't say I love you often, but you knew it. You felt it in how he'd fix your bike before you even asked, or how he'd sit through every Little League game, no matter how hot or cold it was. I'm the youngest. My brother Daniel is 5 years older, and in our house that 5-year gap was a kingdom. Daniel was the firstborn, the golden boy. He got the new sneakers, the extra scoop of mashed potatoes, the seat up front with Dad, and me? I was the responsible one. The one who didn't need much. That's what Mom used to say with a smile like it was a compliment. But Grandpa, he saw me. He'd slip me $1 after dinner, whispering, "Don't tell your brother." He'd wink when he said it, and I'd tuck it in my sock, giggling like it was a secret handshake between us. When Grandpa got sick, it felt like the house itself started breathing differently. Slower. He'd been living in that small white cottage out by Lake Menderson, the one with the creaky porch and the green swing he built himself. Every Sunday, I'd drive out there with groceries and sit with him for hours, listening to his stories about how he and Grandma built everything they had from nothing. Daniel? He came by when he could, usually with a coffee in hand and a phone glued to his ear. But Grandpa never said a bad word about him. He's busy, he'd say. He's got his family now. I didn't argue. I just smiled and peeled him an apple. When Grandpa passed, it was peaceful. He was asleep, holding the old photograph of Grandma. I remember sitting there, watching the rise and fall of his chest slow until it didn't anymore. That moment, it carved something into me I can't quite name. At the funeral, Dad cried for the first time in my life. His hand trembled when he placed the folded flag on the casket. Daniel stood beside him, stoic, his arm around Dad's shoulder, and me, I stood at the edge, my hands in front of me, silent. A week later, the lawyer called, said Grandpa's will was ready to be read. I remember the day vividly. It was raining, not the soft kind, but the kind that makes the whole world gray. We met at Mr. Caldwell's office downtown. The room smelled of paper and old coffee. Dad sat in the middle, Daniel beside him, and me on the far end of the table. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and began to read. The house by the lake, the savings account, the old Chevy truck. Every line felt like a thread being pulled. Until finally Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and said, Mr. Miller's estate, valued at approximately $620,000, shall be divided equally between his two grandsons, Daniel Miller and Michael Miller. For a moment, everything was still. Dad nodded. Daniel didn't say a word. But when we got outside, I noticed the look Dad gave Daniel, a look T wasn't grief. It was something else, something heavier. Life went on. Or at least it pretended to. Months passed. I kept working at the printing company, living in my small apartment downtown. Dad and Daniel started spending more time together fixing up Grandpa's lake house, they said. I tried to visit once, but every time I called, Dad said they were busy handling things. Then one day, I got a text from Daniel. Hey, might be good for you to stop by this weekend. Dad wants to talk. When I arrived, the house looked different. New roof, fresh paint, trimmed lawn. My grandfather's hand-carved swing was gone, replaced with a store-bought bench. Inside, the smell of sawdust and varnish filled the air. Dad was at the table with a stack of papers. Daniel leaned against the counter, sipping coffee. Hey, kiddo, Dad said, smiling too wide. We're just wrapping up some final stuff with the estate. I sat down, still holding my jacket. Daniel slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a single sheet. A transfer agreement. It said I was willingly giving up my share of Grandpa's estate to Daniel to simplify estate management. I remember laughing. Not loud, just a small nervous laugh. Is this a joke? I asked. Dad shook his head. It's just easier this way, Mike. Daniel's been handling the renovations, taxes, upkeep. You don't really want to deal with all that, do you? I looked between them, the man who taught me honesty and the brother who taught me competition. Dad, I said slowly, Grandpa wanted it split equally. That's what the will says. Daniel shrugged. We're still splitting it. You'll get your fair part, just not in property. I'll manage the assets and pay you out when the time's right. When the time's right, I repeated. You mean when you feel like it? Dad frowned. Don't talk like that to your brother. The room went quiet. The clock ticked loud in that silence. I pushed the paper back. No, I'm not signing this. Daniel's smile faded. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making anything hard, I said. I'm just not stupid. That was the first crack. The first time I saw the lines of loyalty in our family blur. A few weeks later, the calls stopped. Dad didn't answer when I rang. Daniel blocked me on social media. And then one day, I drove by the lake house, and there was a for sale sign on the lawn. I called the lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, and asked if I could see the estate documents again. That's when he paused. Michael, your name's no longer listed on the property. Your father signed an amendment last month transferring full ownership to Daniel Miller. I felt my stomach drop. My father signed it? He sighed. Yes, said it was with your consent. That night, I sat in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I kept seeing Grandpa's hands, the way they'd tremble when he'd hand me an apple, the way he'd pat my shoulder and say, family means fairness, son, always fairness. I couldn't sleep, not that night, because something told me this wasn't over. The next morning I drove straight to Dad's place. His old white Ford was parked in the driveway, the same one he'd had since I was a teenager. I used to help him wash it every Sunday, 2 buckets, one for soap, one for rinse. Now I could barely look at it without feeling a knot in my stomach. He was sitting in the living room when I walked in, TV on low, a mug of coffee steaming beside him. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, like the weight of everything had pressed him down. Dad, I said quietly, standing in the doorway. He didn't look up. I talked to Mr. Caldwell, I went on. He said you signed an amendment to Grandpa's will. Without me. He sighed, still not meeting my eyes. Mike, this again? Yes, this again, I said, trying to steady my voice. You signed away my inheritance, Dad. You gave everything to Daniel. Finally, he looked at me, and for a second, I saw guilt flicker across his face. Just F. Or a second. Your brother's got the family, he said. The wife, the kids, the bills. He needs it more than you do. I blinked, trying to process that. He needs it more than I do? That's your reasoning? It's not about reason, he said softly. It's about practicality. You're single, you've got your own job, your own place. You're doing fine. I laughed bitterly. So I'm being punished for not having kids? He didn't answer. He just sipped his coffee and turned his eyes back to the TV like the conversation was over. That hurt more than the betrayal. The indifference. Grandpa wanted it fair, I said, my throat tightening. He trusted you to keep it fair. Don't start preaching to me about your grandfather, he said suddenly, his voice sharp now. I was his son. I took care of him. You came around with groceries once a week. Don't act like you were some saint. I took a step back, stunned. Dad, that's not fair. He set his mug down. Life's not fair, Mike. You'll learn that one day. I stood there for a long time trying to find the words, but none came. When I finally turned to leave, he didn't stop me, didn't even look my way. For a while I tried to let it go, told myself that maybe Dad would come around, maybe Daniel would too, but every time I drove by that lake house, the new sighting gleamed like an accusation. Daniel sold it a month later. $640,000, according to the county records. I found out through a friend, not my father, not my brother. No one even bothered to tell me. It was like I'd been erased. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Grandpa had told me something before he died, something I hadn't thought mattered until now. It was a rainy afternoon, maybe 3 weeks before he passed. I was helping him organize some old documents. His handwriting was shaky, and his memory came and went like wind through the trees. But that day, He was clear. He'd taken out a small leather folder from the drawer and said, "If things ever go sideways, Michael, this here will set it straight." Inside that folder was a copy of his will, notarized, sealed, and signed, and tucked beneath it was a letter written in Grandpa's uneven scrawl. "My estate must be split equally between my grandsons. No one, not even my son, is to alter this. Fairness is my legacy." I'd kept it in my filing cabinet, forgotten under years of tax forms and old receipts. But that night, I pulled it out and laid it flat on my kitchen table. My hands were shaking. I stared at Grandpa's signature, faded but firm, and I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called Mr. Caldwell. He was surprised to hear from me. "Michael," he said, "look, I understand you're upset, but the amendment—" "There was no amendment," I cut in. "Not one Grandpa authorized." He went quiet. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," I said carefully, "that my father forged my consent, and I have Grandpa's original will to prove it." Silence stretched through the line. Then a sigh. "Can you bring it in?" When I arrived at his office, Mr. Caldwell looked uneasy. He took the documents from me and examined them under the lamp, his brow furrowing. "This is quite serious," he murmured. "If this letter is authentic, and it appears to be, then the transfer to your brother is void." He looked up at me. "Michael, do you understand what this means?" I nodded. "It means I have a choice." He leaned back in his chair. "You could press charges, challenge the transfer. It'll cause a storm in your family." "I'm already in the storm," I said quietly. "Might as well see it through." A few days later, I got a call from Daniel. His voice was tight, almost trembling. "You went to Caldwell?" he said. "I did." "Why? You know why." He let out a bitter laugh. "You just can't stand to see me get ahead, can you?" "This isn't about getting ahead," I said. "This is about what's right." "Right?" He snapped. "Dad's the one who held everything together. You think you're the hero because you Ted Grandpa a few times? You don't even know half of what he went through." "Then explain it to me," I said. "Why did you forge my signature?" He hesitated. I could hear him breathing on the line. "Finally," he said, "because Dad asked me to." That silence after those words. It was heavy, like the floor dropped out from under me. "He asked you to?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he said. "He said it'd make things simpler, that Grandpa would have wanted it this way." I closed my eyes. "No, Daniel. Grandpa wanted it fair." He hung up. The legal process started quietly. Mr. Caldwell filed the motion to contest the transfer, attaching Grandpa's letter as evidence. Within a week, I got an email from Daniel's lawyer full of denial, justification, legal jargon. But when the truth started to ripple through the family, that's when things changed. Aunt Carol called first. "Michael," she said softly, "I always wondered why your father and Daniel were so quick to sell that house. Your grandpa would have never wanted that." Then Mom called. She sounded exhausted. "Your father told me not to get involved," she whispered. "But Michael, I saw that document. I knew something didn't add up." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, my voice cracking. She was quiet for a moment before saying, "Because sometimes keeping the peace feels safer than fighting for what's right. That broke me, because that was always my mother, peacekeeper, not truth seeker." The day of the hearing, the air outside the courthouse was sharp with early winter cold. Dad and Daniel stood together by the entrance, both in suits. I hadn't seen either of them in weeks. Dad looked at me when I walked, up his eyes, tired but unreadable. "Michael," he said quietly, "you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," I said, "because you did what you shouldn't have." He didn't respond. He just turned and walked inside. Inside the courtroom, it was all business, no tears, no shouting, just paper and truth. Mr. Caldwell presented the letter, the notarized will, and a handwriting analysis confirming Grandpa's signature. When the judge asked Dad if he'd authorized the transfer, he hesitated just long enough. That pause said everything. The court ruled in my favor. The transfer was voided, the funds to be divided equally as originally written. But there was no satisfaction in winning, just silence. As we left, Daniel brushed past me without a word. Dad didn't look back. That night, I sat at Grandpa's old table, the one I'd salvaged from the cottage before they sold it. I ran my hand over the grain, feeling every scar, every scratch, and I realized something. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about the kind of man I wanted to be. Grandpa used to say fairness is the hardest kind of love because it demands truth, and he was right. For weeks after the court hearing, the silence between us was louder than any argument. No calls, no texts, not even a birthday message. It was like I'd become a stranger to my own family. Sometimes I'd catch myself scrolling through old photos, Daniel and me at the lake, our fishing rods bent under the weight of tiny bluegills, Dad laughing in the background, Grandpa's hat tilted low over his brow. I'd stare at those smiles frozen in time and wonder when exactly they started fading. But the truth is, losing your family isn't one big explosion. It's quiet, it's slow. It's watching people you love slip away one small decision at a time. One night, about 2 months after the court ruling, I got a knock on my door. It was raining again, like the sky had decided to relive every memory of that first betrayal. When I opened the door, Daniel was standing there. He looked exhausted. Wet hair plastered to his forehead, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. His voice didn't sound like the man from the courtroom. It sounded like my brother again, the one I used to chase fireflies with behind Grandpa's cotta. "Gee," I stepped aside. "Yeah, come in." He didn't sit right away, just stood there, staring at the floor. "Dad's not doing too well," he said finally. "He's been drinking a lot, blames himself for everything." I nodded slowly. "Maybe he should—" Daniel flinched, but he didn't argue. "I came here because—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Because I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. For a long time I didn't say anything." The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and I just stared at him, trying to decide if I believed it. "You're sorry?" I asked finally. "For what you did, or for getting caught?" He looked up, eyes red. "For both." That was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in a long time. He sat down across from me, his hands trembling slightly. "You have every right to hate me. I don't even know why I let it get that far. Dad said it was the practical choice that you wouldn't care. But when you fought back, I realized how wrong we were." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "You didn't realize that when you signed my name on those papers?" His jaw clenched. "I thought I was protecting the family. That's how Dad framed it. He said Grandpa trusted him to make the right call, and I wanted to believe that, even if it meant stealing from your own brother." He dropped his gaze. "I didn't see it that way until now. It's strange, forgiveness. It doesn't come all at once. It starts small, like the faint warmth in your chest when you realize you don't want revenge anymore. You just want peace." I poured us both a cup of coffee and sat down. "Daniel," I said quietly, "we were never supposed to fight over money. Grandpa built everything he had with his hands. He didn't leave us wealth, he left us values." He nodded. "I know. Then why'd we forget that?" He stared into his cup. "Because we wanted control more than we wanted peace." That hit hard, because it was true for all of us. Later that week, Daniel asked if I'd come with him to see Dad. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep my distance, but the other part, the one that still remembered Dad's rough hands fixing my bike, his quiet laugh when I burned the pancakes, that part couldn't say no. So I went. Dad's house looked smaller somehow, dimmer. The blinds half closed, dishes piled in the sink. He was sitting in his recliner, the TV flickering low, and untouched beer sweating on the table beside him. He looked up when we walked in, his eyes heavy, unfocused. "Didn't think I'd see both of you here again," he said, voice hoarse. Daniel spoke first. "We just wanted to talk." Dad let out a dry chuckle. "Talk? What's left to talk about? You got your money. You got your justice." I stepped forward slowly. "Dad, I didn't want justice. I wanted fairness. There's a difference." He didn't reply, just stared at me like he was looking at a stranger. "You raised us to be honest," I continued. "You told us to work hard, to play fair, to never cheat. And then you did exactly what you told us not to." His eyes flickered just slightly, like I'd touched something inside him he didn't want to feel. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" I said, my voice shaking now. "You made me doubt every memory I had of this family." For a moment, the only sound was the rain outside. Then slowly, Dad leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're right," he said finally, his voice cracking. "I failed you." Daniel and I both froze. Because we'd never heard him say that before, not to either of us. "I thought I was doing what was best," Dad continued. "Your brother's got mouths to feed. You're independent. I thought you'd be fine." "That's not your decision to make," I said softly. "I know," he whispered. "I just didn't want him to struggle." I thought your grandpa would understand. Grandpa didn't want anyone to struggle, I said. That's why he made it equal. Dad nodded slowly. His eyes glistened, and for a second, he looked just like the man I used to know, strong but human. Flawed but trying. We sat there for hours that night. Talking. Not fixing everything, but trying. Daniel admitted the guilt had been eating him alive. Dad said he hadn't slept a full night since the court date, and me, I just listened. Because sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. Before we left, Dad stood up and said something I'll never forget. I can't undo what I did, he said, voice shaking, but I can spend the rest of my days trying to make it right. And he did. He started going to therapy, joined an AA group, even reached out to our extended family to apologize. Daniel began volunteering with a local charity that helps low-income families manage estates. And me? I started writing again. The kind of personal essays Grandpa loved, reading stories about family, about fairness, about what it really means to do right when no one's watching. A few months later, we gathered at the lake, not at the house that was long gone, but on the shore. Dad had brought a wooden bench he built himself, patterned after Grandpa's old swing. We sat there. Tea with a manila folder. I've been handling some of the post-sale paperwork, he said, setting it on the table. Dad wants you to have this. Inside was a certified check for $310,000, my full share of the inheritance, adjusted after legal fees. But tucked behind it was another envelope. Handwritten. I looked up. What's this? Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Dad said it's for you to read alone. After he left, I opened it. It was a letter, short but heavy. Son, you were right about all of it. I let fear guide me. I was afraid of failing as a father, afraid of leaving Daniel empty-handed, afraid of watching you two drift apart. But in doing so, I became the reason you did. I can't fix the past, but I hope this letter shows you I'm not hiding from it anymore. Love, Dad. The ink was shaky in places. A few drops of water had smudged the bottom, maybe from his tears, maybe from mine when I read it. When the story finally reached my boss at work, she called me into her office. I saw your name in a legal notice a few months back, she said. Something about a contested estate. I hesitated, then nodded. She gave me a sympathetic look. I just wanted to say, good for you. My brothers did the same thing when my mom died. I wish I'd had the courage to speak up, and that's when it hit me how common this story really was. People just don't talk about it. The betrayals that happen in quiet homes over money, love, or fairness. The wounds that don't show on the outside. Later that month, Dad invited Daniel and me to dinner. It was at that same dining table where everything had once fallen apart, where the papers had been slid across to me like a death sentence. But this time, there were no documents. Just dinner. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a small glass of wine each. Dad had even ironed a tablecloth. It felt like a fragile peace offering. Boys, he said, clearing his throat as we ate. I know people have been talking, and I can't change what I did, but I don't want our name to be remembered for that. I want us to be known as the family that learned from it. Daniel nodded quietly. We're already doing that, Dad. He smiled, a real one, not the polite kind he'd been wearing for months. You think so? I know so, Daniel said. We're still here, aren't we? I looked at the both of them, these two men who had once been the source of my deepest hurt, and realized Daniel was right. We were still here, bruised, but together. Not everyone forgave Dad right away. Our cousins whispered about what he did. Some neighbors avoided small talk, but over time, people started seeing the change in him. He started volunteering at the church's food drive, donated some of his savings to the community scholarship fund in Grandpa's name. When people asked why, he'd just smile faintly and say, because fairness matters. It became his quiet mantra. The public consequence wasn't humiliation. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Because in that small town where everyone knows your last name and your family's business, you don't rebuild trust by hiding. You rebuild it by showing up day after day and letting your actions tell the story you can't put into words. And that's exactly what Dad did. He showed up. For birthdays, for dinners, for forgiveness, and somewhere along the way, the whispers about our family changed. No longer those Miller boys who went to court, now it was those Miller boys who made things right. A few months later, the town council approached me. They were starting a community initiative, Fair Hands. They called it a volunteer program to help older residents set up wills and estate plans so families wouldn't fall apart like ours nearly did. They asked if I'd like to help. I said yes. The first time I stood in front of a small group at the library explaining why fairness matters even when it's hard, I could feel my throat tighten. I talked about Grandpa, about how he built his legacy not from money but far. Integrity. I looked out at the faces, older, younger, all listening, and I realized that maybe Grandpa's story wasn't ending with me after all. Maybe it was still being written, every time someone chose honesty over fear. That night, as I walked out of the library, I looked up at the stars, faint and scattered, but still there. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of anger, just gratitude, because sometimes justice isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet restoration, the slow mending of something that was never supposed to break in the first place. The first time I drove past Dad's house after everything happened, it felt like looking at an old photograph of a place that no longer existed. The front yard was still tidy, the same oak tree still cast its shadow on the porch, but something about it seemed smaller, quieter. I sat there for a while, in my car, with the engine running and the air conditioner humming softly. It was early evening that hour when the light turns gold and everything looks softer than it really is. Inside the house, I could see the curtains fluttering, just a little. Dad must have opened the window, something he hadn't done in years. That was when I realized it had been 3 months since I'd seen him. After that day at the lawyer's office, he stopped calling. He didn't text, didn't ask how I was doing, and I didn't chase after him. I figured, after all that shouting, after all those years of imbalance, silence might finally be a kindness. But silence has a way of turning heavy. That evening, sitting in my car, I realized I didn't want to carry that weight anymore. So I parked, walked up to the porch, and rang the bell. It took a long minute before I heard slow footsteps inside. Then the door opened. Dad stood there, smaller than I remembered. His shoulders hunched a bit, his face looked tired, not from age but from guilt. He didn't say anything at first. Neither did I. We just stood there, two people who had built a mountain of misunderstanding between them, trying to find a path through it. Finally, he sighed. "You gonna come in, son?" I nodded. "Yeah, Dad. I think I will." The house smelled the same, faint coffee, old books, and lemon cleaner, but it was quieter than ever. He poured us both a cup of coffee, just like he used to when I was younger. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Grandpa used to sit when he came over. With his strong voice and gentle eyes, Dad spoke first. "I read through the foundation papers," he said quietly. "What you did with Grandpa's money. It's good work, real good." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "It wasn't about the money, Dad. It was about doing something that felt right." He stared into his cup. "I know. That's what makes it harder to swallow. You did right by him. While I was too busy trying to keep your brother happy." There was no anger in his voice this time. "Just regret. I thought I was protecting him," he continued. "After your mom passed, he fell apart, and I just poured everything into him. Money, time, anything to keep him standing. I didn't see what that did to you." His words came slow, deliberate, like they'd been waiting years to escape. I took a deep breath. "Dad, I'm not asking for an apology. I just wanted you to know I'm okay. I've made peace with it." He looked up, eyes glassy. "But I haven't." That's when the silence broke. He started talking, really talking about things I never thought I'd hear. About how Grandpa always meant for both of us to inherit equally. How Dad had let his guilt over losing Mom cloud his judgment. He said he found the letter Grandpa left, the one tucked in the back of that old photo album. The letter said fairness is not about who needs more, but about who deserves trust. Dad said I read that line over and over, and for the first time I realized how much trust I'd broken. There was nothing left to argue. We just sat there, drinking cold coffee, listening to the clock tick on the wall. After a while I smiled. "You know, I don't hate you, Dad." He gave a weak laugh. "You should." "I can't," I said, "because you're the one who taught me how to stand up for what's right even when it costs you something." He didn't say anything after that. Just reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His skin felt thin, fragile, but the grip was still strong. That was the closest we'd come to saying I love you in years. In the months that followed, Dad started coming around to the community center. He didn't say much, just helped with small repairs, fixing light bulbs, painting fences, chatting with the kids. Sometimes I'd catch him smiling, watching them laugh, and I'd see a different man, not the one burdened by pride and guilt, but the father I used to remember. As for Mark, he left town for a while. I heard he sold the house Grandpa left him and moved to North Carolina. We don't talk much, but every Christmas, he sends a short message. Just 3 words, hope you're well. And you know what? That's enough, because not every story needs a perfect ending. Some just need peace. One evening, about a year later, I stood on the porch of the community center looking at the sunset. The kids had gone home, the air smelled of grass and fresh paint, and for the first time in years I felt light. Dad came up beside me, his hands in his jacket pockets. He said quietly, "You did good, son. Grandpa would be proud." I smiled. "He'd be proud of both of us, Dad." We stood there in silence, watching the sky turn pink and gold, and in that silence there was no bitterness left, only the sound of the wind through the trees, and the feeling of something healing, slow and steady. That night, before bed, I opened Grandpa's old letter one more time. His handwriting was shaky but strong. "Wealth comes and goes, but the way a man carries his heart, that's his true inheritance." I folded it carefully, placed it back in the drawer, and whispered more to myself than anyone else. "I get it now, Grandpa. I finally get it. You know, sometimes life doesn't give you the kind of justice that makes headlines. Sometimes it just gives you quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you breathe again." For years, I thought inheritance was about who got what, the land, the money, the legacy. But standing there beside my father, watching the sunset bleed across that old sky, I realized inheritance isn't something written in ink or sealed in envelopes. It's the way we choose to love, even after being broken. It's the courage to forgive, when pride keeps whispering not to. It's knowing when to walk away and when to come back home. My brother may have gotten the bigger share at first, but I got something he didn't understand until much later. Peace, and peace is the kind of wealth you don't split, sell, or lose. Dad and I still talk every week now. Sometimes it's just about the weather, or the coffee shop that opened near his house, or that he finally learned how to use that fancy smartphone Mark bought him. We never talk about the inheritance anymore, because it doesn't matter. What matters is that he learned what fairness really means, and I learned that forgiveness doesn't make you weak, it makes you free. And as for my brother, I like to think he's learning too. Life has a way of teaching all of us some lessons through love, others through loss. I still keep Grandpa's letter in my nightstand. I read it when life feels unfair, or when I start wondering if doing the right thing is worth it. It always reminds me, what you give from your heart will outlive what you take with your hands. So maybe this story isn't about inheritance at all. Maybe it's about something far deeper, how we measure worth in a family, not by what's left behind, but by what we build after the storm passes. If you've ever been the one overlooked, or the one who had to stay quiet while others took what was yours, I hope this story finds you tonight, because one day the truth will find its way home just like I did, and when it does, you'll realize you didn't lose anything that was truly meant for you. Would you have done what I did? Would you have stood your ground, or walked away? Tell me in the comments, because your story might just be the one someone else needs to hear tonight. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and stay a while. We've got more stories to share about forgiveness, family, and finding peace when life doesn't play fair. Until next time, this is Auntie Mary's voice reminding you. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is simply learning how to let go.